Welcome back. Welcome to the long-awaited Iteration 3 lecture, where I'm probably going to tell you less than you'd hope because there's actually not a significant amount to talk about. But nonetheless, here's what we're going to do. The spec, I rewrote this spec like 2 years ago to be structured a little bit nicer, such that when Iteration 3 came around, you only need to read the stuff with the duck. So every other section's the same. You know, we don't really need to go through this or individual contribution or leaderboard, just the duck section. So now we're going to talk about the duck. Okay, so I also did your Iteration 2 lecture this term for Yuchao, and in that lecture I talked about how Iteration 2 had the biggest jump up effect. And Iteration 3 wasn't that big to jump, which is true. At the top of this one, if you remember this from Iteration 2, we also have this little bit of information here, which is saying that there's actually some routes now that are different. Now, the cool thing about this is that when we say they're different, what we actually mean, and I'm just going to jump straight to the Swagger, because a lot of you have probably spent a lot of time looking at the Swagger docs, is if I look at the Swagger, we have our Iteration 2 using Iteration 1, right? Is this traumatic for you to look at a little bit, maybe? Iteration 2 new. And then when we go further down, we've got new stuff now. Wow, look at that long list. But here's the cool part of it. The Iteration 3 routes are broken up into two sections, Iteration 3 modified and Iteration 3 new. The Iteration 3 modified routes, you notice something in particular about them, which is this little number 2 here. This little number 2 means that there's a second version of that route. The good news about that is it means that for all of these routes, you can largely copy and paste the code and make small modifications to it, right? So just like in Iteration 2, remember how Iteration 2 had the stuff that was like a little bit easier because you'd done the work on it, and then it had the stuff you had to do from scratch? Same thing here. All of this stuff in Iteration 3 modified, these are all routes you already have in Iteration 2. So don't be alarmed by the size of that list. The size of what the work looks like is probably inflated by like 5 times. However, this stuff is new. Wow, yay. Mostly what Iteration 3 pertains to in terms of the extra work is the creating of game sessions and the playability of those sessions. So you think about it, Iteration 1's like, yeah, admins can sign up, create a quiz, play with the quiz's name or something. Iteration 2 was a lot of like quiz questions and like duplicating a quiz and a question, right? Like lots of setting up the quiz to be played. Whereas Iteration 3 is all about playing the quiz. It's all like, okay, you've created the quiz in Iteration 2, you've got questions in it. Now how do we have someone click a play button where they can now then go and actually like have other people come into the website and answer questions and whatnot. So that's the crux of what Iteration 3 is about, just at a high level so that you can get ahead of that. But our point is here, what we're saying with this stuff is that you can actually largely copy and paste the routes from Iteration 2 to 3 and expect them to do kind of the same thing, except for these exceptions here, which we've like written out for you. This is just so that you don't have to spot the difference, you know? Because nothing's worse, like Swagger's not really a nice document to like scroll up and down between because it's so big, you know? Like, yeah, sure, you could get 2 windows up side by side and like look at them, but like that's not your job, right? So we've just outlined what that is. What you're doing in Iteration 3, the same thing as Iteration 2, largely. This is a summary, so we'll come back to that at the end, maybe. Running the service is the same. Implementing and testing features is the same. Test coverage. Here's a new section. We talked about coverage back in last week? Was that last week we talked about coverage? I feel like that was a year ago. Goodness gracious. So test coverage, what we're saying is in this iteration, you will be marked on test coverage. So we will, when we run, so I'm just trying to remember, when we run your tests against your tests against your code, we will try and see how well your tests cover all the code in your code. That'll be automatic because we just will run jest on your tests. That doesn't make sense to run it on our tests, does it? Because you're testing tests. Yeah. So the point is that your tests are a little bit more important to get right this time, because in iteration 2, realistically, you could just have one test to test auth register and get like full marks in the auto marks, right? If your implementation was good enough. You get screwed in the other marking, but the auto mark, there was no inhibitor to that. Whereas for iteration 3, you can't get away with writing one test and then just multiplying that by perfect code. So bad test, but amazingly correct code doesn't guarantee full marks here. You also need to show that your tests are amazing as well. Thankfully, because a lot of you have been following good testing practices throughout iteration 2, you're probably in a good spot. This section here, 5.5, planning for the next problem to solve. This is actually quite a big section. What it relates to, if I just jot down to the marking criteria quickly, is a 15% part of iteration 3 that comes down to writing a bit of a document together. That will involve a little bit of conceptual modeling, but mostly it's related to work Yuchao teaches in week 9. So I'm going to leave that one to Yuchao to circle back on, if that makes sense. You can go read it. There's nothing kind of super complicated about it, but it does relate to week 9's lectures. So Yuchao will talk about 5.5, but for now, just imagine it as a black box of kind of like a planning document job. That's 15% of the iteration. That's the only thing I'm not going to be talking about today, because everything else we've covered. This little section here, 5.6, states and actions. Basically, this is also not anything new, except if you go to like the Swagger docs, you'll see that for iteration 3, because you're playing the game now, your software is actually starting to behave like a state machine. Because if you think about a Kahoot and how a Kahoot works, right? The game starts, everyone joins, you're in the waiting room, someone clicks play, first question, countdown, 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 question's done, see the results, new question, you know? Like you could probably draw this out now after we talked about the previous lecture. And what you'll see is in the Swagger docs of these new routes, you'll see things here like state lobby, as in the current state of this particular session of a quiz is lobby state, you know, because you're in the lobby waiting. And similarly, someone can update the state of, an admin can update the state of the quiz, like say, go next question, skip, go straight to the results, right? Just like an admin can in Kahoot. And in those cases, they pass in an action here. Now, all of the actions that you can use are documented inside the Swagger, right? However, because it's a little hard to find, it's a little bit not obvious, even though it's right there in front of you, we did also include a list of it with elaborations in the spec. So all this information is just elaborating on what's in the Swagger, just so it's a bit quicker to digest and see. Because otherwise we would just have to give you this list here, which I think you could probably make some sense of, but it's a little bit hard. And then we backed that up by adding, yes, a Miro diagram that I drew a long time ago here, which is a state diagram for it as well. I'm not going to say that it's the most impressive layout that you've ever seen. It's always upsetting to see lines cross. You know, no one likes a good line crossing in a diagram, but that does explain it for you too. You do not need to request access to edit this diagram. Every term, I get about 6 emails from students who try and sign up to Miro to get edited permissions to the diagram. I don't know why, but I delete those emails like clockwork, so you don't need to do that. Yeah, so there's the states. That's just part of the functionality of iteration 3. If I'm talking about Kahoot and these like lobbies and stuff and you're getting confused, I would really go and play the Kahoot, but I'm pretty sure again that I put that in the iteration 1 video those terms ago as well. So yeah, most of you should be familiar. Error raising, I'm going to come back to that one because that one's a bit more involved. I'm going to come back to that one because that one's a bit more involved. 5.9 deployment. We would like you to deploy your repo to the internet. Now, just to be clear, when we say deploy your repo, we are talking about your, sorry, my brain. We are talking about your like server, not the front end. And I think this is really important because, like, obviously we as a course have deployed a sample solution, which who's played around with the sample front end and all that? Yeah, it's like a lot of you. We deployed both the front end and the back end. Both the front end and the back end are running up on the cloud somewhere. For iteration 3, we don't expect you to deploy the front end. We just expect you to deploy the back end. So what that means is, like, let's imagine you and your group of 3 want to play Kahoot together. After you deploy it successfully, what you should be all able to do is run the front ends locally on your laptop, right? But you can configure the front end to use the server URL of something like a website, like up in the cloud. So basically, you would have 3 front ends running on a local machine. They'd all be talking to something up in the cloud that you've deployed. So in theory, at the end of this course, your aim should be that you can play Kahoot together. That'd be fun. You could play your little Kahoot game, start a game up, see who wins. Maybe the 4th group member can create it and run it, and the other 3 of you can see who wins or something like that. So that's what the deployment part is. There is a Lab 9 deploy that you've probably seen this week that helps you deploy a particular lab. So you can employ what you've learned in Lab 9 deploy to go and get it working for your project as well. It is normal for only one group member to do this, just because, like, only one person can deploy, you know? So I don't want people scared about that for unequal contributions. And no tutor's going to be like, if you say to your tutor, I wrote no code this iteration, but I deployed it, they're going to be like, no, that's not okay. So it's something where, like, you know, deployment might mean that you maybe do like 10 or 20% less coding than someone else if you're really, like, anal about trying to get everything balanced. But generally speaking, I would really recommend with deployment that you pair program that one. It's following a lot of instructions. Lab 9 deploy is quite an elaborate lab. It's not hard, but it's long. It's a lot like the Git setup. Remember Lab 1? And you know what happens? Remember what happened in Lab 1? If you did one little thing wrong or you missed a step, a couple of you probably did that. Like, you end up, nothing's working. And you're going to have the same experience here largely. So I think it is really useful to do it at least with someone else beside you who's, like, following it, because you miss one detail, it can all go pretty badly. And as I've said before, don't go and pay for anything. Everything we've done doesn't require a credit card. If you see yourself punching in a credit card into a website somewhere, stop. Yeah, it's not necessary. 5.10 and 5.11, these two things are similar to this section up here with the states and the actions, in that 5.10 and 5.11 just help elaborate on the behavior of the software for iteration 3. In particular, if you look at the Swagger, some of the last routes here are like, when the game ends, you should be able to get a bunch of results like this. Like, here's the users ranked by the score. Here's all the individual question results. This question, these players got it correct. The average answer time was that. The players correct, % correct is that. This section here is just so that we don't have to shove something again deep in the Swagger where you're going to miss it. We could put that in the Swagger. We could also put this one here, 5.11 in the Swagger, because there's also another route under that, above that. Where is it? Am I losing my mind? Oh, there it is. Sorry. Oh, yeah. OK, sure. Sorry. So these routes down here, all these player routes are for, like, this is what the routes, like, you got to imagine an admin creates a Kahoot and then shares the link with a bunch of players. And the players, when the players are talking to the server, they're calling it through the player routes, whereas all these admin routes are still the person who's managing the server. So there is another one here called, CSV, where you actually are meant to return a file path to a CSV. So you have to create a CSV, a comma-separated file, comma-separated value file. You save it to your server. You return a link to that file. That's what the route does in that case. And again, this has been elaborated on here. Like, if I was to explain this to you, I would just read it out word for word. So this is the kind of thing that's like, I'm just contextualizing what you're looking at. You can read it because the instructions are there, and we try and make sure it's quite thorough. What you will notice again about this iteration is that it does lean itself pretty well towards breaking things up. Like to update a thumbnail for a quiz is kind of unrelated to stuff. The sessions and the session starting like is a little bit blocking, but then like getting the results someone could do after somewhat independently. The player joining to a session can be sort of done independently, but like anything, you can sit down as a group and figure out what should we do first. Like I think for me, it's pretty obvious here that the first thing you should do is probably starting a session, because like once you can do start session there, you unblock everyone else from being able to modify the session or maybe get the results. That might take a little longer, or they can actually start doing this player stuff as well, because you'll see that for a player to join a session, they need a session ID. So it's like you as a group, and I'm like just giving you a big hint here, but I would trust you could all figure this out too. You should sit down and look at this stuff. You know what? Draw a little diagram. It's a great thing. What depends on what? You ever done that? Did you do that in iteration 2? Some of you did? Amazing. See? You're geniuses already. You don't need me. So you go and do that. You figure out that's the starting point. Get that done first. Work on everything else later. Yes. Your iteration 3 has a final presentation. Yuchao should have explained this to you clearly already. You've probably already picked a time slot on the course website. I can see all of your time slots already. And yeah, you just have to turn up in week 11 at that time and do it. I'm not running it this year. I ran the course last term. It was something I introduced. So I probably can't answer a lot of questions about that this term because, again, I just don't have a lot to do with the organization of it. But what I'll tell you is that it was pretty smooth. You turn up as a group at the time. You do the things that the tutor asks you to. They ask a few questions, and then you go, and then you're good. I wouldn't stress too deeply about it because it's not like the end of the world unless you just don't turn up. That's not good. If you just like decide to never appear, that would suck. Got a few questions. I'm just going to get through the criteria quickly and a few other things. This iteration, 60% auto marking, 15% magical. Yuchao talks about stuff next week. 5% code quality, 10% Git project. So a lot of this is just, more auto marking, less on the fluffy stuff. 10% of marks come from showing that it does work with the front end and that you can get it deployed. So this is like just 2 features of that 10%. And then there is a bonus marks up for grabs for 10% if you can get all of your code totally type compliant based on those rules. Yes? So the bonus marks will increase your iteration 3 mark, right? However, if your iteration 3 mark goes above 100%, that'll flow into the other iterations, yes. So if you follow these instructions, add this to your ESLint-RC file, when you run npm run tsc, you will potentially get errors. Basically, the current tsc command from memory, if you say const blah equals foo any, the current tsc command I think will pass that for you, or the lint command or whatever. Like this will be okay. The extra rule that we get you to add in, if you want the bonus marks, will stop this from working. You basically can't use any. Yeah, because the tsc has a rule called no implicit any, which says that you can't not define it. Like if you want to use any, you have to explicitly say any. Whereas this rule says no explicit any either. And it's like, no, every type should be clearly the right type, and you can't use any as a way to cheat out of it. I don't know the exact numbers of how many groups did this last term. I'm trying to remember. I think it was about 1 in 2 groups did it, which is probably a good indicator for you. If you feel like your group's in the bottom half of the course, maybe stay away from it for a while at least. And if you feel like your group's in the top half of the course, or especially the top part of the course, then I would probably jump in it early, because like the tighter your TypeScript is, it'll also help you find bugs, Like there's a fixed amount of time you have to spend getting types working. So if you can do that early as opposed to late, you end up using the same amount of time, but the earlier you do it, the more likely you are to uncover other issues, which will speed up your life in general. It's another great thing to do if someone's kind of like a little blocked, like if you say, you want to get started tomorrow and you got to get a few things done before everyone has a lot of work to do, you can just get started on things like TypeScript or deployment. You should be able to deploy your project now. You don't have to wait till you're done iteration 3. Sure, it won't all work, but like nothing stops you deploying it either. In terms of the mark, I made a rough allusion to this. It's kind of calculated here. This is just a formula for coverage in this particular case. You can kind of unpack that in your own time, but it's basically saying like good coverage will mean that you get full marks for that. If you don't have good coverage, then it means that it's bad. I think this formula's been changed this term. I haven't really been told much about it. So I can only answer so many questions about it, but it's all generally the same principle. Coverage is now part of the marking criteria. We have a dry run, and we have a due date, and we have peer assessment, and they're kind of some of the main things. This mouse, if everyone can see, it's just being real glitchy. I don't know what's wrong with this stupid computer. I can't click on anything. Okay. So can we just follow the Swagger and finish every function on it, then works will be done? I guess so. I mean, you'll do relatively well in the correctness part of the auto marking. But yeah, I mean, if you want to ask, if I just do the Swagger, will everything work okay? I mean, the auto marks are 60% of the marks, and the auto mark you get from our marker is multiplied by stuff to do with your tests, So you couldn't just do the Swagger. That would maybe, get you part of the way. So you probably can't think about it quite that tight. Do we need to write tests for iteration 2 modified routes even if we be calling the same function, v1 and v2? Yes, but thankfully you can copy and paste those. I'll get to that too. Let me add a note to that. Wait, did I delete my stuff? Yep. v1, v2. Do player sessions match whatever the quiz session is? Think of player sessions as like, in iteration 2 you had a user and a user had sessions. Iteration 3, quizzes exist and quizzes have sessions, It's like it's basically saying that if you have a game and a game's like a template and you can start a version of a game, because what happens if you're running a school, right, and you've got a great quiz and you've got 3 year 4 classes, and you all want them to play the Kahoot in their own separate classes and not together. You need to create 3 sessions of that singular quiz. For the thumbnail route, it says it's updating the thumbnail. Is it also adding the thumbnail if there isn't already one? I don't know. I don't actually run a lot of that level of detail with the spec. Because I did write this now like a year and a bit ago, but every term they make like slight adjustments to it. Like students have problems and they tweak this and tweak that. So I don't want to answer a question that granular. That's a good one for the forum, just because there's a more than 1% chance I'll give you the wrong answer. So they're the questions so far. So now if we go back to, firstly, let me talk about this whole V1, V2 thing. So the reason this was introduced is because, again, we talked about this back in week 4. In reality, when someone introduces a updated version of logout, right, they don't just delete the old route or overwrite it. They need to support both at the same time. Because like other people are still using your old logout route. You're a company and you're providing a service and people are using it. So you've got a new one over here and you would like them to get off it in the next few years, but for a while you need to support both. So we do actually want you to have both. And in the scenario where you have both, it's not super unreasonable a lot of the time to copy and paste. Like you're just going to copy and paste the route, because like you've got a separate route with a separate URL. The degree to which it's reasonable to have, duplicated code or not is kind of up to your discretion to some extent to do your best judgment with. But the question about tests, yes, you will need to duplicate your tests, but that's okay. Testing is inherently a bit of a messy copy and paste topic a lot of the time. Like a lot of tests are actually people copying and paste. Like you've probably seen this with usernames and passwords, that you copy and paste, you change the values. You could probably wrap it in a really complicated for loop with arrays and stuff, but we don't want to do that. We need to keep it really simple. So that's just on that part. What exactly is different about the V2 routes we will get to, because that is one of the things we need to chat about. Someone says, how should implementing chatting be approached? I mean, I don't know how to answer that effectively. Like, as in, that's kind of your job to figure out. I could probably answer a slightly more targeted question if someone's like, I'm trying to use this, will that work, or will there be any problems with it? Brendan says, are timers going to be used for the project? That's on the YouTube. That's a great question. There is a tiny bit. There's very little. We've kept it to be quite small. But there will be a part of the project that uses JavaScript's set timeout feature. You haven't dealt much with this, and I'm not going to talk about it in really much depth at all, because it is something that I think falls in the realm of you should be able to tinker with it and get comfortable with it. Has anyone used this for anything so far? A couple of people. It's really quite a straightforward thing. This makes it look scary, but at its core, it's a function in JavaScript where you pass it in a function and then you give it a time in the future to call it. It's a deferred function call function. So instead of you call a function, what you do is you call set timeout and you say, instead of calling this function now, I want to call it in 3 seconds from now. That's all it does. It's quite straightforward. You don't actually need much more than that here, as far as I know, again, unless something has changed. There's one small part of the project I think you need it for, and the other part, if I'm not mistaken, is that the project has been written in a way that if you don't actually ever get around to it, you can actually skip that tiny part of the project and you barely lose any marks anyway. So I don't want anyone to feel like that's a blocker or that's a stressful part of things at all. Now let me go back to 5.7 and 5.8. Let me start with 5.8 because this one should be pretty easy. Part of iteration 3 is about creating safer user sessions and secure passwords. Cool thing about this is that I explained a lot of this to you on Monday. We spent a lot of time together. First part is we expect you to secure your passwords for iteration 3. That means we expect you to hash your passwords. It's pretty easy thing to tick. Your tutors will be looking for that. The other one is we ask you to create more random user session IDs. Now, this summarizes also what I said, which is that your user IDs should be unpredictable at minimum. However, that doesn't make them totally tamper-proof. What makes them tamper-proof is doing something like the signature that we also talked about on Monday, which you can also look into if you'd like. It's something that, as I've said, you don't have to do that. You just have to make sure your user IDs are somewhat more random. However, I would encourage you to try that out. I think it's like, saying something's important doesn't really motivate people to do it that much, but I do think that one is quite interesting. And there'll probably be someone in your group that cares. So 5.8.1 and 5.8.2 are just saying do what we taught on Monday. 5.8.3 though is a little bit more involved. So everyone remember back in week 4 how we talked about how for get and delete requests you send things over the query, right? It's what you've been doing for a few weeks, so I assume you remember it. You don't have a body for get and delete requests. Does everyone also remember how in week 4 we talked about how everything you send in the URL is clear as day for everyone who intercepts it and everything in the body's encrypted? Cool. Has anyone had a moment where you're sitting there thinking during iteration 2 that we're sending a lot of tokens and secure information over the URL as the query for get and delete requests? There's a lot of sensitive stuff out there, because if I get your token, I can imitate you. Like, I don't remember if I showed you this. I think I did. I did on Monday. This course website. The thing that logs me in is this thing here called equals JWT. I'm not going to show you the whole thing, but never mind. Now I have to log out and log back in again. Someone will bloody copy and paste that. But point is, if someone could really quickly right now copy and paste that into your one, right? before I hit that logout button and invalidate the session, which you all get that now because the session's now gone, you could be me. Because all the browser's doing every time a page is loaded is sending that thing, that token back to the server. So that token in a way is like a password, you know? It's quite important. This is also why we make sure it's not tamper-proof. Okay, so just to clarify, if you took my token and put it into your computer, because you can edit these fields if you'd like to, you could be me. But because it's a tamper-proof token, you couldn't use it to modify it to try and be someone else, you know, because of that whole signature thing we talked about on Monday. But if you got it, you could still use it. So like if your friend leaves you their laptop open or something, you could literally open up, and don't do it, you could literally open up Instagram, find some random token, copy and paste it into your computer, and then you refresh your Instagram page and you're now logged in as them. Because that's all the information they have. It's not always stored here, it's stored in different places, and it can be much more complicated than that. But the point is, tokens are important, so we don't like to send them over the URL. Sending a GET request as like a token in a query string is a terrible idea. It's disastrous, in fact. So to get around that, and how everyone else does it, is they don't actually send a token through the URL. And they don't send it through the body in GET requests because you don't have a body in a GET request. So where they do send it is this other part of the request called a header. And a header contains a bunch of random information. It's basically the metadata of the request. It contains things like what type of content am I sending you? Am I sending you an image or text or code or whatever else, or JSON? And what it means is that in our code, instead of in our server, and again, I'm trying to give you the gist of it without telling you exactly what, because there are instructions here, is like if you maybe have a route that says like app.get, you know, v2 blah blah like this, request response like that, you currently might have something that says like const token equals request.query.token like that. What we're saying is that you need to change your approach to, instead of doing that, you need to use this instead. Now, then the next question is, well, how in the world do I send that over the header? You know, when I send a request, just let me just quickly find the code. I normally have it up, but again, I'm on this loaner laptop at the moment, so my life is quite challenging. It's not really challenging, that's a bit dramatic. Where am I? Testing? Working with Jest. Oh, yeah. So if we look at this piece of code here, in particular this part, and you should again be familiar with this because this is kind of, you know, iteration 2 stuff. You're like, okay, well, I make a request. Look it up. Again, I'd like to challenge you to have to look stuff up yourself, but next to the query string or the body, because, you know, in some requests there's a body, there's just another parameter out there called header or headers, I think. I can't remember if it's headers or headers, but there you'll be able to add token, blah, 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 like that, you know? That's just it. So instead of it sending through the query string or the body, like you're doing in iteration 2, you just have to send it as a header. Now, all the headers of a request are encrypted. That's why we send it through a header. What this means is that for most of your iteration 3 modified routes, the only difference between the v2 and the v1 versions largely is going to be how the token is handled. That's the main difference. The other differences are very rapidly summarized at the top of this iteration 3 section here for you. But besides these changes here, the only difference is that the token is now handled through the header, and that is a fairly trivial change. It is also why you will need to, you know, naturally copy and paste your tests to make sure that, like, you know, like, because if you copy and paste your tests, the tests will look the same. They'll just change how the data's passed through. It's hard with testing sometimes. Sometimes we want to not copy and paste it. We want to super abstract it. But with testing, it's so important that our tests are really clear, you know? Too much abstraction in testing can, like, make our code ugly. In fact, like, I would rarely abstract my tests more than this here. Because, like, you want someone to be able to, like, literally understand it. The general rule of tests are, like, They should generally not call too many like nested functions, and they should avoid loops wherever they can. It's okay. It's kind of funny that it's a little bit different to normal code, because normal code we want to really focus on never repeating ourselves, and we're happy to make the code a little bit more complicated in exchange for a little loss of clarity, in exchange for kind of I don't know how to put it, more robustness, I guess. Where am I clicking? Here I am. So that's what 5.8 is about.
So changing the token headers, is that just for the V2 functions? We don't need to change the V1 stuff for iteration 2?
Correct, yeah. And yes, and I'm glad you mentioned that, because what this brings up is that part of our testing, our auto marking for iteration 3, will actually call all of your iteration 2 routes. So imagine that the iteration 3 auto marker is actually 20% just the iteration 2 auto marker. If that makes sense. Calling the iteration 2 routes that you've already done. And the other 80% is those new routes we've got, the new 2 sections. The reason we do that as well is because we're really trying to emphasize the importance of having your code be fully robust in the midst of establishing new parts to it, Like all of your old stuff still needs to work fine. But again, behind the scenes, it's not going to be too bad, because you're going to have like a V1 auth register, admin auth register, like in your, say, server.ts, right? Maybe that's not the best example. Maybe like an admin quiz. You'll have like your get admin quiz, and which is like your iteration 2 one. And all that's going to do is be like, yep, const token equals request.query.token, and then it's going to be called like admin quiz get or something like that, pass in some stuff to it, and it's going to do some whatever, return some stuff. And then what you do is for iteration 3, you're able to kind of copy and paste that. It's a V2 route now, and instead of you capturing it through the query, you capture it through the header, and now you've got 2 routes, but they still call, because what they do after they dissect the HTTP part there is they call the exact same function, which has the same functionality. You as a programmer would be like, well, I shouldn't copy and paste admin quiz get, because some people out there might make like an iteration 2 function and an iteration 3 function or something and copy and paste them. But why would you? They're the same thing right now. They literally perform the same behavior. So it makes no sense to separate that out or duplicate that. So, a lot of this project has, in a good way, tried to evolve in the direction of making you think a lot about complex software and how to structure it and manage it. So hopefully that sends you down that path as well. The last thing is a new section that's been added this term, which is also, of a similar principle of trying to improve your software development. It's to do with errors being raised. So in week 5, Yuchao taught you exceptions, I believe. In this iteration, this one isn't actually too bad. What we would like you to do is, if you have a function like a admin quiz get or whatever in quiz.ts, right now that function probably does some stuff, and if there's a problem, it probably does something like return error, there was a problem, right? Like you do like an early return with an object that contains an error key in it. For iteration 3, we're asking that you refactor your code. This is all going to be manually checked because it shouldn't change your code's behavior. You refactor it to, instead of returning stuff, we want you to throw, I can't remember, oh my God, my JavaScript throw exception. I'm not sure if new's there. I look at 4 different languages a week, so sometimes throw new error. Okay. I was about to write throw new exception. I was about to do that, and I was like, is new meant to be there? But that wasn't the problem. It's not exception. I teach C++ this term mostly. That's my main course I'm teaching. So it's like my brain's all over the place. Throw new error, there was a problem. So instead of returning an object with error in it and then checking if in your server if the returned object contains an error key, you're simply going to be wrapping your function calls in the server in a try-catch and throwing exceptions in your underlying functions, if that makes sense. That in itself is actually not terrible, and in some ways it'll actually make your code easier to read because you don't have to deal with all the weird return cases and stuff, because it's just you throw the exception and the function's going to end. But there are two rules that are really important that we want you to follow for iteration 3. And many of you will maybe have been following them already, and some of you haven't been. The spec has an attempt to describe this in some detail, though I'm going to describe it for you, I guess, in my own ways, which is that outside of server.ts, there should be no reference to 400, 401, or 403. And the other rule is that server.ts routes should never, ever, ever pass in request or response into a subsequent function. Now, an example of this one being violated, this first one, would be if maybe I should make that more dramatic. Let's make that more dramatic. Yeah. Drama. Okay. ASCII art. So in this first case here, an example would be if I have a server.ts file and I've got my app.get, v1 blah, request, response, and what I do is that when I call admin auth register, one of the things that I passed into it might be a response object. And I do that, so in my auth.ts, in my admin auth register function, when I take in my response, I can be really lazy and just say, you know what, response.json, error. Basically rather than have to send the error back up and then, response. Status 400 or whatever. I don't think many of you would do that because your iteration 0 and 1 routes were so well prescribed, you've probably never changed what they take in, just out of habit, most of you. So that's not really a concern. This second part, though, is slightly more interesting. For some groups, won't be a lot of thinking, and for other groups, depending on how you've done stuff, might be a lot of thinking, which is that we don't want to see any reference inside files like auth.ts or quiz.ts to 400, 401, 403 errors. What that means in those cases is if you've got this admin auth register function, what we don't want to see is people say, if there's a problem there, returning something, for instance, that says like error, user already registered, status 400. Does anyone do that currently? Okay, interesting. Good. So let me just quickly explain to you. So the reason that we want to steer you away from that is because one principle that's always really important in software is separation of concerns, which is like your server file is essentially something concerned with reading HTTP requests and making responses. And it generally has, and it should have very little to understand about how the Kahoot actually works. It doesn't really know much about quizzes or what a quiz is or what a state is or what an action is. It's just kind of this like nearly translator from HTTP land to JavaScript land, right? And it kind of protects your app from like bad tokens and things like that. Similarly, your auth.ts and your quiz.ts, sometimes we refer to these files as application logic or business logic. And that means it's the logic that is actually specific to that app you're trying to build, right? Like if you think about it, you're making an application or a business, it does that for you. It really doesn't need to know much or do anything about HTTP stuff either, because it's not relating to that. That's good function design in code. That's good separation, where you have stuff not understanding, not having to know what everyone else is doing. So part of that is figuring out a way where you can, generally speaking, not have references to HTTP-like stuff in functions that don't give a crap where they're being used. Because if you're not sure what I mean, once you start throwing HTTP statuses in these functions to put them in there, now this function is forever implied that it's for use on the web servers, But what happens if someone wants to use it somewhere else, like say iteration 1 or somewhere where there's no HTTP server, right? The function shouldn't care about where it's being used. It should focus on its job and not really much more than that. I know we only have 5 minutes left, so I will unpack that with a slight more example, but I want to get to a question or two.
If we throw the errors inside the functions themselves, then how would we know which status code to return the server up?
That's the question. Well, that was all I was going to talk about anyway, so that works really well. Thank you. The short answer And I'm not saying that this rule would apply all the time, every day in bigger projects, but in the context of this project, the cool thing is that there's only 3 status codes that you generally throw, right? And one of the better parts is that a status 401 and 403, they often relate quite heavily to, particularly 401, relate quite heavily to a token specifically. And how a lot of you have probably done your iteration 2 code is you've come along and you've said like, well, you've got 3 steps here, which is I'm going to fetch the data from request, I'm going to call a function, get the return, and then I'm going to respond with JSON. And you probably have like a really tight little file there. What you then probably find is that as you have your admin auth register here, I bet in many cases your admin auth register is taking in a token, right? Put your hand up if your admin auth register is taking in a token. Right, well, let's think about it for a second. Does admin auth register really need to understand a token, which is basically a form of like HTTP communication? You know, like it's a way of packaging up information inside HTTP. It probably doesn't. So you know what? Probably before admin auth register, you should have a way to extract that up here, or say like, you know, check user from token, which might take in the token and return, say, user ID or something like that. You know, outside of that admin auth register function, so that when you actually, what you actually pass into admin auth register is itself a user ID. Because like the point is, admin auth register, quiz and all that, they shouldn't really be decoding HTTP tokens, you know, to do with JWTs. That's all about authentication and whatnot, and you can separate that out. So, I mean, that's just one example of how to do it, but the really short answer with this to your question is like, a lot of where this feels painful is because a lot of groups will converge themselves into like, each route calls one function which does everything for me. But it's actually okay to maybe call a couple of functions in your routes that do separate things. And quite often what you'll find is this can actually clean up your code a bit, because, you know, decoding a token and figuring out if someone's logged in, why should that have anything to do with the quiz create, quiz get, quiz modify? Those functions should be concerned with just modifying the quiz, not making sure anyone's even allowed to. You know, like if you get to a point where you're calling a quiz modify function, there probably should be a separate function that was called beforehand that checked if you should even get that far. So the purpose of that rule is mostly to make you think about your software in a slightly more separated way, because without that rule, it's very easy to fall into that trap of I've just got a big function that does everything. I hope that was helpful. Yeah, cool. Yes?
So are you essentially saying just do your error checks in the route?
What I would probably say more colloquially, and this is the first time we've introduced this, so like my communication skills will be the weakest on this naturally, because first time I've ever said this to people in a course. But what I would say is like, me quoting myself, generally a function should probably generally a function, if it has potential errors, should probably only be related to one type of error. That's probably what I'd say. As in like, if you're calling a function and it goes wrong, you should probably be like, if it's gone wrong, that function going wrong means that it was a 403. And if I called that function and it went wrong, it's probably a 400. And if I called that function and it went wrong, it's a 401. It's probably harder in the real world. It's actually really easy in the project, because like if you think about it, you simply like decode the token, and if the token's invalid, it's a 401, easy. And then you check like, is this person who, you know, they permission to do this, which might be a bit more fiddly. That's one check, and that's a 403, right? And any other error you experience after that's a 400. Because once you've verified the token's valid and you know who they are, any other problem you see is just a 400. And that actually makes this project a really easy place to do that. In reality, it probably does get a bit more nuanced and complicated with what all this means. So I don't want anyone to like, again, I always have this fear of like people ending up in the workforce. As you'd be surprised, a bunch of 1531 students, they hunt me down. Like my startup, we build an app really like quickly. We're a startup, we're building stuff quickly. So we actually don't do a lot of what we teach in this course. And I got a student like email me like 2 years ago. They were like, I did 1531 with you in 2019 and you instilled into me the importance of testing. And I used your app the other day and it was buggy. And all my inspirations about, you know, software correctness are like gone, and you've disappointed me and stuff. So what I don't want is like random stuff, like you get into the workplace and you're like, some random dude was like, I cannot mention the word 400 outside of a file, and then they're just going to be like, what? So don't take that to literal gospel. It's just a great rule for this project to get you thinking about separating things out that you probably aren't separating out at the moment. Really quick, there was a question, how do you write a header when requesting for the server stuff, etc.? I did kind of cover that like 10 minutes ago. That was when we pulled up this stuff and I wrote a little bit of code here. I said go look it up specifically, but it's a really quick, easy thing to Google. Actually ChatGPT is also really, really smart. I guarantee you, if you took one of your test files, pasted it into ChatGPT, and said, I need to add a header here called token, it would just give you the code again. And that's a great example again of how LLMs can help you actually learn something quickly without kind of, you know, plagiarizing the whole thing. So you could try that out if you want to. But any other questions, shoot them to the forum. Otherwise, thank you, and I'll see you all in week 10, probably online. But yeah, thank you for putting up with me for a few weeks.